Hi, this is Dr. C. Today we're going to talk about a subject that you may not want to talk about. What's new, right? We're going to talk about suicide. Okay. Happens to be now a 50-year anniversary that the movie MASH came in. And why did I say MASH? Because the theme song for MASH is "Suicide is Painless." Now, maybe a lot of you don't remember the movie itself. It was 50 years ago, in 1970, that it came out. The director was Robert Altman, quite a well-known director at that time. He could not think of a good song that could be the theme for his movie. During the movie, in the MASH unit, there was a dentist who had suicide ideation. So when Robert Altman went home, he was beside himself. He didn't have a good song. He did have a good melody, however, because he had Johnny Mandel, who was the singer there, and he had the song, but not the lyrics. He had a 15-year-old son, Robert Altman, named Michael Altman. He wrote the lyrics to that song, supposedly, I don't know if it's true or not, supposedly in 15 minutes. He wrote all the lyrics for the song. And the movie came out. A very successful movie, I should say. That movie then got converted into a TV series, which we're all quite familiar with, and a lot of the characters in that TV show are still very much on our minds because we still can see the show every now and then on TV. And so that's kind of an interesting byline, 50 years ago. So, suicide. Like I said, the definition of suicide is an act of intentionally causing one's own death. Intentionally causing one's own death. In 2018, there were 47,000 suicides in the United States. Worldwide, in that same year, there were over 250,000 suicides. And these are underreported now. Underreported. So it is a major issue. There are more people who die every year from suicide than in many of the wars that we have had. It is a major issue. Now, admittedly, the majority of the suicides are in a much younger age group. For a while, it was the age group in the 20s. Now, it's in the teenage years. That's the highest peak now in suicides. There's also another peak that occurs over 75 years of age. I'm going to focus on that particular number of people because this is more of a senior show. So what are the risk factors for committing suicide? The number one risk factor, which stands out, is a previous attempt at suicide. Not all of the attempts at suicide in the younger age range are successful. In fact, 1 in 200 is successful because a lot of them are from cuts, overdoses. In other words, not really a totally serious type of attempt. And those attempts in the younger years are impulsive. Somebody just cannot go any longer. They have to do it now. Looking at the seniors, 1 in 200 in the younger age group, 1 in 4 are successful in the senior age group. 1 in 4. Males tend to shoot themselves or hang themselves. That's usually pretty successful. Women in the older age range, again, tend to overdose. So they may or may not be successful. The big spike now in the younger age range comes from opioid use. Now, it may not be an opioid that does them in, but usually it's something related to one of the fentanyl drugs. In other words, it could be something that is not intentional, but it was intentional to take the drug, but they didn't know what was in it. So, that is the number one risk factor. What's the second risk factor? Depression, especially when you get into some of the bipolar depressions. The other thing, too, schizophrenia. That has its ups and downs as well. And when you're in that upper part, you may, again, become impulsive and attempt suicide. What's the next one? Substance abuse. We mentioned that. Impulsivity. Usually this is in the younger age group, again. Impulsivity. May be related to stress. The stresses are different in the younger age range than they are in the elderly. The elderly tend to have different stresses like financial stress, family issue, medical issue in yourself. Those can be very stressful. Maybe loss of a spouse. All these things can lead to that impulsivity and suicide. Otherwise, we see it in military veterans with PTSD. And that is a big issue in that particular group. We see it always in the LGBT group as well. Now, it's becoming a little less prevalent now in the LGBT group because now it is not uncommon to come out of the closet a little more, and it is a little more acceptable now. That has taken a while, but that's a good thing that has become more acceptable in society now. The presence of a home firearm. We wouldn't allow a firearm in our house. I'm not against people going out hunting. That's perfectly fine, perfectly fine. But you don't need some of the assault weapons in the household. That is a big issue. So, those are all of the risk factors for suicide. Generally, towards the end, when you get towards the time that you're thinking about the suicide, then drugs become an issue because you've got to calm that mind down a bit. So alcohol or maybe even marijuana get involved at the last moment as well. So those are issues that we have to think about. Remember, suicide in general is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. 10th leading cause. But it is the second leading cause in the teenage years. The second leading cause of death. So, what are we going to do about it? Well, in the elder population, there's some things that really do bother them, and I can understand how it does. Loss of control of your health, loss of control of your finances. You think you're a burden on your family now because you have to get reimbursed by the family because of loss of money. I mentioned the loss of a loved one. A fear of no longer being independent. Now you're dependent on the family or a friend or whatever for housing or whatever, for food, for medicine. You may wind up with loneliness. Now, loneliness now, I know there was an article very recently in the AARP journal about loneliness. It's not an easy thing to define because there's acute loneliness. Let's say you go to summer camp or something, there's nobody from your family, no friends around. All of a sudden, you're in a different location, new people. You may get lonely. Kids who go to college, for example, they may get lonely. Those are examples that don't necessarily lead to thoughts of suicide. Where do you draw the line? When do people start thinking about it? What's the thing that puts you over the line to think that maybe this is the best way out? Well, a lot of people have thought about it. And I don't know if they've come up with a single answer or not. What do we tell the seniors to try to get them to think less about the possibility of suicide? Well, first of all, you got to take a senior seriously. If they talk about it, in other words, verbal statements that they're talking about suicide, you got to take it seriously. A senior may change their behavior habits. All of a sudden, they withdraw from society in general. They become more isolated. That is a risk factor. It is. Also, there may be signs now of depression. And certainly isolation is part of it. Insomnia is part of it. All those you got to think about when you see this in a person and they've never been this way before. I start thinking about suicide when the seniors start giving away some of their real prized possessions now. Kind of emptying the house of anything that's worth anything to them. That's not a normal situation. Now, it is normal to have your prized possessions and all assigned maybe to family members once you pass. That's normal. In fact, you should do that. But when they're doing this indiscriminately, then that is a red flag. Maybe a person has lost interest in all the things that they like to do. For example, if I suddenly stop doing exercise, if I suddenly stop putting on shows, you'd kind of wonder what's going on with him. So there's a marked change, basically. You need to be aware of that. And you need to do something about it. And finally, you got this issue of mental illness as well. Maybe somebody now has a problem with the mental illness which came out later in life. Maybe there were signs of it earlier but were never recognized. And now they're talking about suicide. So, how do you approach somebody when you feel that they may be in line to do this to themselves? Well, you can ask them directly. Privately, of course, but ask them directly. If it's a family member, they're not going to get mad at you. Maybe they'll open up to you. But you've got to ask them. Secondly, you've got to be available. Like I said, isolation is part of the whole thing. If they say, boy, I really like to have you come over today, I got to talk about something, you drop things, you go, because they may not be there the next day. So you need to get involved. You've got to be available. If they do talk about it, you've got to be non-judgmental. Don't tell them, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. Of course they can't do that, but they can do that. And so don't be judgmental with them. And finally, you've got to talk them into contacting a professional. First of all, you may want to just give them the National Suicide Prevention Hotline number, 1-800-273-8250. That's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Or you may have them contact one of the psychologists or psychiatrists. People don't like to see a psychiatrist. Nothing wrong with me, nothing wrong with me. Well, maybe just their primary care, and let them put that patient in with a good consult with psychiatry. So that's what you can do. You know, just in 2019, they did some large studies about suicide. Do you know that in the United States, 10.6 million people thought of hurting themselves? They thought of it. 10.6 million. 3.2 million actually had a plan. They had a plan about how they could do it. 1.4 million in the United States last year attempted suicide. Now, that's a general number. That included the young and the old. So the younger ones, remember, 1 in 200 was successful. But 1 in 4 was successful in the senior population. So it is something that you need to think about. There's also this thing that the CDC reported on the emergency room visits. Generally, on the study that they did, the largest number, as I think I told you before, was in that 10 to 19, the teenage years. But we're talking here of seniors. So women over 60, roughly 29% of them thought of suicide. And in the men over 60, 37% thought of suicide. They didn't attempt it, but they thought of it. Now remember those numbers now that I told you. It's only a certain percentage of them that actually followed through with it. There's this other issue. It's called silent suicide. What is silent suicide? Well, by definition, it's a masked intention to kill yourself by non-violent means. In other words, self-neglect. Person next door, living in squalor, don't take their medicines, don't dress properly, don't clean up the house. This is the type of thing that is causing silent suicide. Generally, those are people who are living alone, They have their own house or apartment. Maybe nobody looking in on them. In other words, there's a loneliness component to this as well. They are the ones who need the help. Now, I know in town here in Shrewsbury, we have a thing called a triad, and usually a neighbor will call the police and say, listen, we're worried about this guy or this lady who lives next door, and we haven't seen him in a week or 2 weeks or whatever, and we're worried about him. We knocked on the door, no answer. Well, the triad then will talk about it, and they will send social worker in to see if they can find out what's going on. Occasionally, that social worker will be let in, and then a dialogue will be started with the person who is living in this squalor. The unfortunate part of this is that there's very little means to follow up in Shrewsbury on this. There are very few people who are willing to go in and to do this, because you're not going to get reimbursed. It's not a big reimbursable thing. You're not going to make any money doing this, but you may save a life, and that is worth more than money. And so this problem with silent suicide is not something that's reported very often. If these people go into the hospital, they're labeled as failure to thrive. You know, failure to thrive. What does that mean, really? Doesn't mean anything. Call it what it is. It is a silent suicide. They may call it a pseudo-dementia because they can't really pinpoint any specific dementia. What does that mean, pseudo-dementia? Means nothing. Means nothing. Maybe this person will then refuse treatment. And maybe the psychiatrist will say, well, they're competent. They can refuse treatment if they want. And of course, they do. Silent suicide. It is an issue here in Shrewsbury as well as all over the state. So, it is something that you need to be aware of. Be aware of your neighbors. If you haven't seen somebody for a number of weeks and they don't seem to be coming out of the house, give them a call. Knock on their door. See what is the condition inside. Be positive about it. And then report it. That's the best thing that you can do. So what else can we do to help some of these people who are thinking about suicide? We've got to strengthen their support system. They have to have appropriate housing. I talked about affordable housing, that it was only 6.2% in Shrewsbury. Lousy. We're mandated to do 10%. But remember, in Massachusetts, Massachusetts is number 48 out of 50 states in a place that is comfortable to retire. That's wonderful, isn't it? So, strengthen their economic support with good housing, and if you have to, get them involved with Medicaid. At least then they would have the option of some good health care as well as the housing. What else can you do? Well, we also need to have a protective environment. We've got to secure their environment. That's where the good housing comes in. What do they do in Shrewsbury? They send you to a senior housing unit, send you to the Towers, send you over to Francis Gardens, Elizabeth Gardens. Again, does that give you a secure environment? Well, if you talk to the people who live in that environment, you'll find out that it isn't as secure as you think. They're keeping it quiet in the town of Shrewsbury. Why? Why? This is something that needs to be addressed, and addressed in a fashion that puts it out so that the people who are out there, who are willing to help, who are capable of helping, have the experience of helping, can get involved. So, we've got to promote connectiveness. We've got to get those people who are in those units involved. Maybe they have experience. Maybe they still have their faculties. Maybe they can still do things. You've got to get them involved, get them connected, socially connected. That's the key, social connection. Sometimes you have to teach them coping skills. That isn't that easy, but sometimes you have to educate them as well. And so, with those points, there are a couple of things that I mentioned when I was on the Bob Abraham show, Know the Facts. A couple of things that I mentioned that could also be done. Number one, a mentoring program. Have some of the seniors attached to one of the children in town. Have them mentor them. Young people, maybe they're interested in that particular profession that senior was in, and the senior was very good at it. They can really mentor that child. They can do a lot of good. Not necessarily only in high school, but even younger age group. Use that mentoring program. I would also like to see an education program run in the schools, evening hours or late afternoon hours. Have the seniors as the teachers. They'll volunteer. They'll be happy to do this. Have them volunteer on their expertise. And who can attend this? Anybody can attend it. It can be any age group. And they can learn from the experiences that the seniors have already experienced themselves. I would love to see those two things happen in the town. Absolutely, it's necessary. I would also like to see more intergenerational contact. We are a community. We need to act as a community. No bickering, no fighting between generations, but act as a community. Seniors helping young, young interacting with seniors. Believe me, as a senior myself, I love to interact with the younger people as well. And I think I still have enough faculty. I don't have what I used to, but I can still do some teaching as well. I'd love to see that happen in the town. So, given those things, as we started the program, MASH. That dentist never did commit suicide. I don't think that the song had anything to do with why he didn't do it at all. But it is interesting that the song itself, Suicide is Painless, it sure as heck isn't painless. There are a lot of things that happen as a result of that, not only with family, but with the community itself. It's been very nice talking to you again. Sorry about the subject, but it had to be said. Have a nice day. This is Dr. C.